several talks the problems with representing disfigurement, perhaps particularly photographically, but I think maybe this problem extends to naturalistic portraiture generally, because of course portraiture is supposed to distill the essence of the sitter into a single image, and in these cases I was going to say that there almost seems to be, I think there's an ethical problem with that perhaps even a violence in that act of distillation. In 2006, the New York-based photographer Nina Berman was approached by People magazine to take photographs for a story about a US Marine sergeant called Tyler Ziegel, who'd been trapped in his burning truck after a suicide bomber attack on the Iraq-Syria border in December 2004. Ty had been in Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas for 18 months by the time Berman met him, and undergone 19 operations. His shattered skull and face had needed to be reconstructed. He'd lost an eye, one arm, and 3 fingers from his other hand. Ty's high school sweetheart and fiancée, Renee Klein, moved from their small town in the rural Midwest to be with him during his treatment and recovery. For the assignment, Berman met the couple and Ty's mother at Brooke Army, and then spent several days with them at home in Metamora, Illinois, a few months later. She returned for their wedding in October 2006, which was declared a state holiday, Tyler and Renee Klein Day, and took this photograph in the commercial portrait studio in town on the way to the wedding ceremony, which was held at Metamora High School. In the end, People magazine didn't use the photograph, and Berman entered it in the World Press Photo Contest. When Marine Wedding won the prize for portraiture, the online response was phenomenal. The photo was viewed by hundreds of thousands of people and became the subject of countless blog posts and comment threads. For many Americans, it's still an iconic image of the war in Iraq. Reviewing an exhibition of Berman's photographs at the Jen Beckman Gallery in New York in August 2007, the New York Times art critic Holland Cotter remarked that Marine Wedding speaks as powerfully as a picture can for itself. But the stream of interpretive commentary in the blogosphere suggests otherwise. As Lindsay Beierstein observed in Salon, which is an online magazine, everyone sees something different. Marine Wedding was a catalyst. A picture might be worth 1,000 words, but in this case, it was the bloggers who provided them. The image, says Berman, got linked to by everyone from pro-war sites to anti-war sites, to sites dedicated to love and Valentine's Day. The reaction to this one image confirmed what Susan Sontag argued in her 2003 book regarding the pain of others. No we should be taken for granted when the subject is looking at another person's pain. Pictures, least of all pictures of war and suffering, cannot be depended upon to speak for themselves. Now, it would be possible to use Marine Wedding to ask all kinds of questions about the medical, military, social or psychological response to serious combat injuries. These are clearly important issues, but it's equally crucial to interrogate and understand the representation of war and injury, because the military body, of course, is more than flesh and blood. It's also a symbolic site invested with political as well as personal meaning. And this is a point that's come up repeatedly as well, the extent to which these men own their own bodies and the images of their injuries. Valour, heroism, patriotism, courage, sacrifice, these concepts assume visible form and do their cultural, ideological work when they're personified and embodied. Mutilated or disabled, the veteran's body can connote the hollowness or corruption of these ideals, a theme most famously exploited in Weimar Germany by the artists associated with the New Objectivity movement. Such symbolic anatomies have long interested sociologists and anthropologists who recognise that the body is a primary system or microcosm of meaning, whether social, political, or even cosmological, speaking as a medievalist for a second. The sociologist Brian Turner, for example, has suggested that the dominant concerns and anxieties of society tend to be translated into disturbed images of the body. The mutilated face of war arguably has a special place in this symbolic economy, signifying, perhaps more than any other image, the brutalising, dehumanising potential of modern combat. And yet the face of war is a paradox. The human cost of war, which is the theme we're dealing with, is signified here by the absence or travesty of the recognisably human face, or at the very least, its partial destruction or erasure. In the review I mentioned earlier, Holland Cotter describes Siegel's expression as he looks at his bride as, quote, hard to read. His dead white face is all but featureless, with no nose and no chin, as blank as a pullover mask. So in a way this is face as mask. Berman's photographs of wounded veterans disturb the very logic of portraiture, that the face can be relied upon as an index of identity and emotion. So for some time now, my research has focused on representations of the injured body in First World War Britain, in particular the public rhetoric and visual record of facial injury and disfigurement. There was no British equivalent to Otto Dix or Max Beckmann. The mutilated and disfigured face of the veteran wasn't exploited as a site of collective shame, the way it was in Weimar Germany, for example. In fact, aside from medical photographs, there are few exceptions to the tacit censorship of facial injury. One of these exceptional cases is, of course, Henry Tonks, whose pastel drawings of soldiers before and after reconstructive surgery lie somewhere between medical illustration and portraiture. These intimate studies reveal a great deal about Tonks' approach to life drawing and perhaps the surprising proximity of beauty and horror. But they tell us very little about the public visual culture of disfigurement. Tonks himself, of course, had been a surgeon before his celebrated career at the Slade School of Art, and the portraits, as we know, were never intended for the curious eyes of the public. The other significant artistic response to facial injury in First World War Britain is a series of photographs taken by the official home front photographer Horace Nichols, documenting the making and fitting of a prosthetic mask. Now these are just as difficult, I think, to classify as Tonks' drawings, blurring the line, in this case, between photojournalism, art photography and official record keeping. Like most of Nichols' photographs for Wellington House, the government's propaganda bureau, the series he captioned "Repairing War's Ravages" seems to have remained unseen by the British public. Facial casualties were described in the wartime press as the loneliest of all Tommies. Facial injury as a dreadful abyss, the worst loss of all, because it deprives a man of the visible proof of his identity. Journalists invariably appealed to the miracles of modern medicine, the godlike work of the plastic surgeon or sculptor. But this rhetoric was much harder to translate into visual images. In this respect, Brian Turner's observation that social anxieties tend to be manifest in images of bodily disorder needs, I think, some qualification, because these are very often the images that are most subject to censorship. Nichols' photographs play on the fantasy of perfect repair. The two young men portrayed in the series are self-composed, their wounds less horrific than many of those in the case files. But still, it's hard to imagine them serving as propaganda. The photographs are contemplative rather than reassuring, evoking the loss alluded to in written accounts, as well as the sculptor's skill. For me, these 12 carefully constructed pictures are ultimately about artifice and absence. They record the hope of reconstruction and at the same time its impossibility. The unnamed patient we see here is painstakingly restored, his blind eye opened with the stroke of a paintbrush. But in the end, when we've shown the sculptor, Francis Derwent Wood, examining the finished plate, it's the exquisiteness, the uncanny naturalism of the mask one is drawn to, as though we were looking at some sort of relic or perhaps death mask. The patient's exposed face, scarred and impassive, appears incomplete in comparison. Derwent Wood is most famous today for his 9-foot bronze David on the Machine Gun Corps Memorial at Hyde Park Corner. He joined the Royal Army Medical Corps as an orderly at the 3rd London General Hospital, along with several other members of the Chelsea Arts Club. Having revolutionised the plaster and splints department, he persuaded the hospital's commanding officer to let him make painted metal masks for severely disfigured servicemen. "My work begins where the work of the surgeon is completed," he reported in The Lancet. "When the surgeon has done all he can to restore functions, I endeavour, by means of the skill I happen to possess as a sculptor, to make a man's face as near as possible to what it looked like before he was wounded." So Wood's aim was to meticulously recreate the patient's original appearance from his remaining features and from pre-injury photographs, often given as a keepsake to a wife or sweetheart. If an eye was missing, he tried to match the original colour from the remaining one, or failing that, from a relative's description, painting the reverse of a glass blank or directly onto the plate. In the Lancet article, Wood describes how a clay or plasticine squeeze would be taken from the initial cast in order to produce a positive model of the face that could be added to, gradually built up, and then recast in plaster. On this mask, a paper-thin copper electrotype shell was deposited, coated with silver, and painted to match the texture and tone of the individual's skin. Cream-coloured bath enamel, Wood says, provided a good base for Caucasian skin, and the sheen of oily skin was replicated with varnish rubbed down to match the patient's complexion. Rather than use hair for eyebrows and eyelashes, Wood found that the results were better if he painted the eyebrows directly onto the plate and used very thin metallic foil for the eyelashes, which he would cut into fine strips and then hand tint and curl and solder in place. Each plate, he says, took around 1 month to complete. Mask making was an individualised, highly skilled and labour-intensive activity. Unlike the manufacture of prosthetic limbs, there were no standardised parts, no economies of scale, no mechanised production processes. Considerable skill and expense was devoted to an object that did not, as Wood himself points out, restore function to the patient or alleviate his physical suffering. What they could do, he claims, is lessen a patient's psychological pain and social isolation. And I realise that there's quite a lot of debate about this claim. Wood wasn't the only sculptor associated with this kind of work during the First World War. Kathleen Scott, who's also already been mentioned, the wife of Captain Robert Scott of Antarctic fame, and one of Henry Tonk's former students, worked at the Ellerman Facial Hospital for officers in Regent's Park and wrote in her diary that making faces made her feel terribly like God, the creator. In Paris, the American sculptor Anna Coleman Ladd opened a studio for portrait masks under the auspices of the American Red Cross. I'm going to show you the film, which is also in the exhibition, so many of you will have seen it. I wondered whether I should leave it out, but actually I'd like to look at it in this context, partly because I think it's such an extraordinary historical document. It's a silent film. It's a film that we know very little about. Other than the fact that it must have been taken at the same time that the photographs were taken, and the photographs in the archives of American art are stamped with the American Red Cross stamp. So we assume that the film was also commissioned by the American Red Cross. And in this sense, we have to also bear in mind that it's propaganda. But nevertheless, the sort of social interactions that the film captures, I think, are absent from the written sources. And it's this, even the quality of touch in the film is really quite extraordinary, and something you don't get from the photographs either. So. Hopefully if I click on it, yeah, it's just going to play. It's only about 4 minutes long. It's also on the Smithsonian Magazine website if anybody wants to look at it again. So this is Anna Coleman Ladd. We've seen her arriving at her rather lovely studio on the top floor of this building. It looks very much like an artist's studio. Her assistants here are also sculptors, very well established, respected sculptors. You can see at one point, if you look carefully, there's a little sculpted rabbit on a shelf, which was made by not this woman who's American, but Jane Pupelet, who we saw previously. So the ear's going into a copper bath and the electric charge is being put through. I've always wondered whether this is a soup tureen or a chamber pot. It really reminds me of a scene in a hairdresser's or a beauty parlour. Of course, everybody's puffing away. There are before and after photographs of these men in the Anna Coleman Ladd files. And in a few cases, letters written from them to Ladd after the war, enclosing photographs of them, you know, thanking her. Before the war, Ladd had established a name for herself as a sort of celebrity sculptress with portrait commissions from people like Anna Pavlova and the Princess Borghese. When the United States entered the war in spring 1917, Ladd's husband, who was a prominent Boston paediatrician, Maynard Ladd, assumed responsibility for the Children's Bureau of the American Red Cross. The suggestion that she might also go to France and make portrait masks for the mutilated came from the English art critic Lewis Hind, who mentioned Derwent Wood's work to her during a visit to her studio in Massachusetts. By Christmas, she was installed in this large artist studio in the Latin Quarter. Among her papers are sepia prints of this bright high-ceilinged room decorated with posters, flowers and an American flag. Most of the portraits are in the before and after format, some of them taken in the studio, as you see here, some of them in front of an improvised black curtain. One wall of the studio was hung with casts of faces arranged in rows like this, almost like an array of death masks. Some of the finished plates are displayed on a makeshift table, so the tablecloth and the plates are propped up there. And this vase of flowers, there's the little rabbit. The vase of flowers and a little figurine complete this rather pleasing composition. While the medical subject matter of the casts is novel in this context of an artist's studio, plaster replicas of legs, arms, feet and hands were a common sight in artist studios of the time, often displayed on walls like this or lined up on bookshelves. The social ease and conviviality revealed in the photographs and film is very different from the quiet melancholy of Horace Nichol's photographs. In Paris, the studio for portrait masks evidently served a social as well as practical function. There was a regular Tuesday tea, and at any one time there might be half a dozen visitors, including surgeons and interested members of the public. As Ladd recollected, oftentimes these poilus would come in with gifts of flowers for the studio. We always tried to keep the place cheerful and frequently had the boys sitting around playing games. The blind ones played dominoes and the others checkers. We served them chocolates, cigarettes and their favourite vin blanc, and I defy anyone to find a happier group than was there assembled in that Parisian studio. They were never treated as though anything were the matter with them. We laughed with them and helped them to forget. That is what they longed for and deeply appreciated. Unlike staff at a military hospital, whose priority was to return the wounded to active service, Ladd and her colleagues saw their job as humanitarian, enabling the mutilated to return to civilian and domestic life. Back in the States, she embarked on a series of public lectures about her work in France. Articles in magazines and the Sunday papers quoted from the letters of gratitude sent by her boys and reproduced photographs from her personal album. She even travelled with a bag of masks and plates. I don't know whether these were ones that didn't end up being used, but there's one story by a journalist who says she was a bit shocked when Ladd pulled out of her bag all these masks and just sort of lined them up on the table in the hotel room. To the extent that they hid what couldn't be shown, the bespoke masks produced in London and Paris belong within a long history of censorship and stigma. Like most artists of their generation, Wood and Ladd saw beauty and ugliness in moral terms. As the art historian David Lubin observes of Ladd, she revered physical beauty and believed with wholehearted conviction that ugliness and deformity should be kept out of sight. For him, the portrait mask enterprise, despite the noble intentions of those involved, was one more officially sanctioned attempt to conceal war's brutality behind a false front. The word portrait, notes historian Ludmila Jordanova, has an air of formality to it. It conjures up both a pose for a specific purpose and a maker, someone who's more than a friend, a relation, or a casual acquaintance. A portrait is more than a snapshot and different from a medical photograph, in part because it bestows authority on the subject portrayed and also implicitly on the maker, the artist or sculptor. In this respect, none of our portraits are straightforward. Rifleman Moss's portrait, you see the portrait mask in this photograph up here. Many of you have probably seen it already. It's one of the ones that's quite frequently reproduced. This portrait mask was certainly, I think, an attempt to restore presence and authority. In this sense, all portraits are forms of physical capital, as the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu defines it. In other words, an investment in one's public face. But the mask, unlike the commissioned portrait, also draws attention to the inability of art or medicine to recreate something that's lost forever. Nichol's photographs and Tonks' portraits are just as equivocal. There is in the photographs a suggestion of the godlike work of creating faces, a familiar trope at the time. But if anything, this undermines the authority of the creation. When I was writing about the Tonks pastels, I found myself thinking of them as anti-portraits because they convey the fragility and mutability of subjectivity rather than consolidating the self portrayed. And this is an idea that I took from an art historian called Ernst van Alphen, who argues that the portrayer, in the case of portraiture, proves his or her artistic originality and skill by consolidating the self of the portrayed. So this, I think, doesn't happen in the Tonks portraits. Nina Berman doesn't portray injured veterans as victims, but nor are they survivors in the popular sense of the term. In Marine Wedding and in her earlier project called Purple Hearts from 2004, she focuses on the homecoming, the protracted and difficult, perhaps impossible transition from the military to civilian life, from able-bodied soldier or Marine to disabled veteran rather. In contrast, the historical examples we've looked at contain virtually no biographical information. And of course, unlike Tonks or Nichols, Berman addresses these images and stories to us. And I suppose this as well is one of the things about the Tonks portraits, and perhaps one of the reasons why they've started to be exhibited as war art, because I think there's no clear message, no clear political agenda. There certainly is for Berman, and for that reason her photographs have been sort of very often criticised. But certainly I think one of the things that you could say of her is that these are clearly used in an anti-war context. She writes about her work as well. These are angry photographs for all their, perhaps stylistic reserve. Berman mentions in an interview that Ziegel was possibly the least self-conscious person she'd ever met. Yet she was well aware that part of the story had to be how people look at him. And to that extent, the series is about the stigma of disability and disfigurement, as Irving Goffman describes it. And as James pointed out as well, for Goffman, disfigurement is defined not as something which is intrinsic to the person who's stigmatised, but as something which is apparent within a particular context. Goffman says stigma occurs within a particular social interaction. By the time Goffman was writing his book in the early 60s, there was already a substantial literature on stigma in social psychology and sociology. But the term itself, of course, has a much longer history. And here I get to be a medievalist again. But even before the Middle Ages, in the original Greek, the verb stigmatize meant quite literally to mark or brand with a hot iron. Such a stigma would identify the bearer as a criminal, a slave, or a traitor. Adapted by early Christians, the word came to denote, and I'm quoting Goffman here, bodily signs of holy grace that took the form of eruptive blossoms on the skin. It's such a nice description. But the notion that one could be marked by God coexisted with an early proto-medical understanding of stigma as a symptom of physical or moral disorder. Even today, this idea persists. And I think in the pre-modern period, this understanding of stigma as relating to both, so I suppose, psychological, moral, but also physical blemishes, that refusal to separate the physical from the moral is something which we still, bear the legacy of. In Ty's case, we're likely to read his physical scars as the symptom or visible evidence of an invisible psychological condition, proof not of God's grace or of human wickedness, but of the traumatising, dehumanising effects of war. Portraiture, of course, has become a primary means of framing war in contemporary Western culture. It's through the portrait and its textual equivalent, the biography, that we've come to experience, to feel the human dimension of violent conflict. This is particularly true of professional photojournalism, which relies above all on the emotional legibility and expressiveness of the human face. Not every image of a face is a portrait, however, and portraiture doesn't always require facial likeness. Picasso's Cubist portraits don't look very much like their subjects, and contemporary portraiture often disrupts the conventional association between facial appearance and identity. What then does it mean to put a face to suffering and violence? And what are the effects and limits of traditional portraiture when the face itself has been transformed by war? In her book Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, Judith Butler questions the assumption that representation itself bestows humanity on the otherwise faceless, anonymous statistics of war. Faces in the media, she points out, can, and often do, personify evil or liberation or terror. The now iconic faces of Yasser Arafat, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden are obvious examples of this. These are variations on a very common theme, the media portrait of evil. In much the same way, the faces of unveiled Afghan women serve as emblems of American cultural progress. Photojournalism exploits the human face's capacity to convey a sense of the individual, while at the same time signifying a generic type or attribute, the face of suffering or liberation, the face of evil. Not surprisingly, many artists and photographers have sought to distance themselves from these cliches. If the human face of war is ubiquitous in the news media, it's often entirely absent from museums and art galleries. Some of the most compelling contemporary photographs that deal with war and conflict are devoid of any human subject matter, dwelling instead on the post-apocalyptic aftermath of conflict. Urban wastelands, architectural ruins, depopulated villages, and the surreal topography of battle-scarred landscapes or mass graves. One of the most successful proponents of this genre, which has been described as the military sublime, Simon Norfolk, has said that he prefers taking pictures of landscapes, partly because, in his words, people gobble up the photograph. They become what the photograph is. Norfolk's large format photographs of post-invasion Baghdad were shown alongside work by Paul Seawright, Adam Broomberg, and Oliver Channeran at the 2008 Brighton Photo Biennial in a themed exhibition called The Sublime Image of Destruction. Julian Stalabras, the biennial's curator, initially wanted to include an enlarged print of a seriously injured Iraqi child in Zafaranaya Hospital. This image. Norfolk had been urged to take the photograph by the Iraqis who were present at the scene. In it we see 18-month-old Zainab Thamar, her small face smeared with blood, lying with her eyes closed on a brightly patterned bedspread. A sheet of white gauze placed lightly over her soiled yellow dress is the only sign of medical intervention. Norfolk must have leant over the hospital bed to get close enough, and you can almost touch the pink fleece on the underside of the blanket. That the portrait of Zainab Thamar puts a face to the horrors of war is, I think, unarguable. But placed alongside images of sublime destruction, the photograph raised a number of troubling questions for Stalabras and his colleagues. How did the image, and I'm taking these questions from the catalogue for the photo biennial, how did the image with its focus on the face of an individual fit with the more general scenes of ruination in the exhibition? What did the inflation of size do to its meaning as the depiction of an individual? Had the child survived? Viewers would surely want to know. So you put a person in there, put a face in there, and there's almost a sort of biographical narrative imperative. You just have to know what happened to her. After much deliberation, they decided not to use the print on the grounds that to do so would be to reduce Zainab Thamar to an icon of the general, an object lesson on the consequences of war. This is a dilemma for anyone engaged with the representation of war. For Sarah James, who's a historian of photography and contributed to the catalogue for the exhibition, for James, this photograph does something else. It shows us what is absent from the sublime image of destruction. The sublime, she writes, cannot accommodate flesh, bodies or selves. How then can it produce empathy or awareness of fellow suffering? Linda Nochlin observed that what we look for in a portrait, unlike, say, a medical photograph or a police mugshot, is the meeting of two subjectivities, the subjectivity of the person portrayed and that of the artist. Nina Berman's presence, stylistically, I think, can be felt in her photographs in a certain formality of pose and composition, a stillness or reverie, and in the deep saturated colours that declare a distance from the documentary look. I don't believe in the notion of the objective photographer, she said. But the meeting of subjectivities that Nochlin refers to extends also to the viewer, in the sense that when you look at a portrait, if you think of it as a good portrait, the idea is that you have a sense of personal connection to the person portrayed, as well as a sense of, imagining that relationship between the sitter and the portrait painter, photographer, sculptor. But these are not intimate photographs. There's little sense of psychological connection with the people depicted and little evidence of intimacy between them. Berman's theme, I think, is isolation. But the insinuation of psychological distance coexists with an extraordinary attention to the material texture of the lives she photographs. The gleam of the buttons on Ty's dress uniform, the disconcertingly rubbery folds of his prosthetic hand, the stiff whiteness of Renee's wedding gown and her carefully, lovingly manicured fingernails. These details are replete with narrative significance. Ty's interior life may not be apparent in his face, which, captured in a photograph, can probably only signify trauma. Unlike Berman or his friends and family, we can't speak to him. If you closed your eyes, she says at one point, you would feel that he was a completely healthy person. The only identity we have access to is embedded in the material fabric of his life. Berman's technical and formal achievements are even more apparent when the photographs are displayed as large format prints in an art gallery. I first saw Marine Wedding at the Wellcome Collection's War and Medicine exhibition, which is not specifically an art context, as you know. It's an exhibition space that often displays objects that relate to medical history alongside art. But in this case, it was the scale of the photograph that immediately declared it as art, rather than photojournalism, say, or studio photography. Formal beauty has come to seem rather suspect in the context of war, and Berman's inclusion in the 2010 Whitney Biennial drew some predictably disgruntled responses. One blogger described the Whitney show as dehumanising because it totally aesthetises the work so that you think about it in terms of art and compositions rather than the human content. But I wonder if this criticism only holds if we can agree on what art is. And I don't think that my understanding of art is quite the same as that blogger's understanding of art. What is art in the context of the Whitney or the Wellcome collection? Part of the answer, especially in the last 4 or 5 decades, is that art is a means of interrogating beauty, representation, identity, and spectatorship. Social class, gender, politics, military service, all of these factors frame the public response to this story, as much as they inform the identities depicted. Berman's achievement is to exploit the conventions of portraiture and our expectations of, say, the wedding portrait, while resisting the temptation to consolidate or distill the person or self portrayed. Instead, the portrait photograph becomes a vehicle through which identity might be questioned, along with the concept of likeness. When facial identity is masked or damaged, when the image of a face signifies trauma rather than character or emotion, then conventional expectations of facial likeness break down. In its place in Berman's photographs is a more dispersed and more contingent understanding of identity as something that has to be assembled and managed in the sense that Irving Goffman uses that term, the management of spoiled identity. Identity is something that can be spoiled, a fragile thing that can be made in a small town photographic studio and perhaps unmade in a moment of unguarded staring. And I'll finish there. I'll leave that image up. There is more to the Ty and Renee story, which I can tell you if anybody wants to know. I always feel slightly uncertain about sort of burdening this material with a particularly tragic story, but fairly recently, when I was working on this material, I already knew that the marriage didn't in fact last very long. They split up in under a year. They, by all accounts, remained good friends. But in December 2012, Ziegel fell on some ice and then was later reported to have died from his injuries. It was quite a strange story. Subsequently, there was a coroner's inquiry, and they found that he had very high quantities of both alcohol and morphine indicative of heroin in his blood, and it's likely that it was the combination of the alcohol and the heroin that killed him rather than the fall. So in a way, I think, one has to speculate, but in a way it seems to me that, he did die of his injuries. So I don't know how far that takes us in relation to portraiture, but certainly I think there is a sort of compulsion to know how the story turned out. Mm.